Hey everyone, thus far we've been talking about message effects, what persuasion researchers largely call message effects, which is the study of the content of a message, trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of what makes a particular message effective, successful, ineffective, unsuccessful. And that really comprises the bulk of persuasion research in the US Academy from, let's say, 1920 to about the early 1960s. And the story there is pretty clear, which is that with the outbreak of World War I, the use of propaganda to manipulate public opinion before and after World War I, with the rise, as we talked briefly about a couple weeks ago, the rise of public relations and mass advertising in the United States, with the concurrent rise of mass communication technology, especially in the form of radio, but the speed of technology and communication with the invention of the telegraph, and of course the outbreak of the television in the 1930s, 40s, and especially the 1950s. It really changed the game and led communication researchers in the US Defense Department, the CIA, and many others to be quite concerned, both from a security standpoint, that demagogues in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere could pull the levers of mass communication to manipulate public opinion quite quickly, or even corporations could do so for nefarious or socially impactful purposes. Again, use the levers of communication to affect people's lives quite immediately. So a massive amount of research, persuasion research, really comprises that, which is that we are concerned that X, Y, and Z messages cause X, Y, and Z very predictable causal effects in audiences, which presume that audiences interpret messages pretty similarly, right? They're really flattening out audiences. The cognitive processes are not that difficult, are not that different. The audience themselves are not that different. In the context in which they're encountering and hearing and grappling and associating themselves with these messages, if there are differences, they're not important. Those are the assumptions of these models. And out of that comes really powerful strains of research, some of which we've talked about. One of the most famous examples is the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. Convenes in 1937, is concerned about obviously the aftermath of World War I and the precursors of World War I, the use of propaganda to create what was then the largest conflict in human history. And then, of course, the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s. These folks saw the writing on the wall. They were concerned with, again, another outbreak of a world war right before the start of World War II. And so what they create then is an incredibly influential 7 techniques analysis of propaganda. And I'm going to get these 7 techniques right, so I'm going to rely on my notes a little bit. But the 7 techniques they said that everyone should watch out for, in a sense to inoculate themselves against, were the use of name calling, ad hominem attacks, attacks on your opponents, not your opponent's positions or arguments, glittering generalities, which is speaking in grand rhetorical terms to dress up ugly ideas, the transfer of association, which means to take something negative and associate it with something positive, testimonial, or using experts to gin up support for an idea that doesn't have a lot of support on its own, but essentially to falsely convince somebody because experts allegedly believe that something is a good idea. Plain folks appeals, which is a populist appeal. Everybody thinks this way. Regular people, normal, real, red-blooded Americans feel this way. Why don't you feel this way? Card stacking, which is an older term, but it essentially just means over exaggerating or under exaggerating, really changing the facts of a particular issue to make it sound more poignant, more resonant with an audience. And then finally, bandwagon appeals. Everybody's doing it, so why don't you? So they come up with these 7 techniques of propaganda analysis, and the assumption there is that all audiences everywhere can fall victim to one or all 7 of these, and so the more that you watch out for these, the better off you're going to be in resisting and then reproducing anti-propaganda techniques as a citizen of the mass-mediated world. This really leads then to inoculation theory in the early 1960s, and inoculation theory is really concerned with giving people counter-arguments before they encounter arguments. And there's some initial research that shows that when people are inoculated against arguments, somebody's going to try to sell you encyclopedias door to door. Here are the things they're going to say. Here are the counter arguments. Then you'll be ready, right? Think about a time in your life, maybe when you've had to make a big purchase and you've been worried about getting sold by a salesperson. And so you prepare your lines in advance and you research the tactics that they're going to use on you. And so you come in more prepared for the tough conversation, not to get sold, not to get manipulated, not to get persuaded. So you feel more comfortable. That's inoculation theory in action. And it really comes out of that model. Academically speaking, outside of inoculation theory and outside of the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, what we're finding in these periods is that early communication researchers are using really basic models of communication. The two names here are the hypodermic needle model and the magic bullet model, which essentially just says, in both cases, that in motivated sequencing, somebody, a sender of a message, has an idea and can implant that idea more or less perfectly in the mind, in the consciousness of the receiver, so that you take to image the metaphor of a hypodermic needle. The needle includes the message, and I can implant that message more or less unchanged into your brains. The same is true of a magic bullet, just a different metaphor. Around the 1960s and 1970s, researchers began to really complicate these ideas, and that's where we want to spend our time on today. It's when we move away from message effects research, the kind of which the Institute for Propaganda Analysis and many others were engaged in, and move towards a model that sees audiences not as passive, not as kind of cool consumers who just let information wash over them and then can replicate and regurgitate exactly what these folks want you to think, the demagogues of the word, the sheeple of the world would like you to think, but instead seeing audiences as more rational, more engaged, and more engaged in persuading themselves. They hear an idea, and then they try to integrate that idea into what they already believe and experiences they've already had with similar objects, what their friends and family might think, and so forth, the subjective norms that we've talked about in this course quite a bit. So the big BC to AD shift, if you'll pardon the metaphor, really that we're talking about in this week is message effects models, which are message-based models of persuasion, and then moving those aside and creating space for receiver-based models that are looking into the cognitions and thoughts, psyches, and contexts of the ways in which people are hearing messages and how they can contribute to their own persuasion or inoculate themselves against persuasive attempts.